Sometimes the greatest strength is found not in guarding our hearts, but in daring to open them even when they are fragile. It was late in the evening. The air was cool and crisp with a light breeze rustling through the olive trees. The sky above was painted with soft hues of purple and deep indigo as twilight gave way to the encroaching night. Stars began to blink into existence, scattered like diamonds across the heavens. Jesus and his disciples had just finished a long day of teaching, walking from village to village. The group was now resting on a hillside, the ground beneath them soft from the day's warmth. As they gathered around Jesus, the disciples felt a mix of exhaustion and contemplation. They had witnessed great wonders and heard many parables that day, yet a weight seemed to press upon their hearts. The unspoken tension in the group was palpable. For all they had learned, there was a question lingering in the hearts of the disciples, one that none had yet dared to ask aloud. They had seen the power of love in action, the healing of the sick, the feeding of the hungry, the embrace of the outcast. Yet, deep down they each carried a fear of being hurt, fear of exposing their weaknesses, and fear of opening their hearts to others. As they sat in a circle around Jesus, the crackling of the fire the only sound, Peter finally spoke up. His voice, normally bold and confident, was quieter than usual, tinged with uncertainty. "Master," Peter began, glancing at the others, "you have taught us about love. We have seen how you show compassion to everyone, how you embrace even those who betray and abandon you. But how can we love like that? How can we open our hearts when the world is filled with pain and rejection? How do we love without fear?" The other disciples nodded, their expressions mirroring Peter's concern. They had all experienced moments when love felt risky, even dangerous. They had seen friends turn into enemies, and they had felt the sting of betrayal. The desire to protect their hearts was strong. Jesus, who had been quietly listening, looked around at his friends with deep compassion. His eyes, full of understanding, held a warmth that reassured them. He knew the fears that troubled their hearts, and he knew the weight of the question they were asking. With a gentle smile, Jesus leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. "I see the question that rests in your hearts," Jesus said softly. "You wonder how you can truly love without fear of being hurt. You wonder if it is possible to open your heart to others without breaking it." The disciples watched him closely, their faces filled with both anticipation and vulnerability. Jesus continued, his voice like a soothing balm. "There is a story I wish to share with you," he said. "It is a story about a man named Eli, whose journey will help you understand the true nature of the heart and the power of vulnerability." The disciples leaned in closer, sensing that this story would carry a profound truth. They had heard many of Jesus' parables before, but something about this moment felt different. There was an intimacy, a deeper resonance with the struggles they each carried. "Once, in a village hidden between two great mountains," Jesus began, his voice carrying softly in the night air, "there lived a man named Eli. Eli was known in the village for his gentle nature and his kindness to others. He was a man who cared deeply for those around him, always ready to lend a hand or share a kind word. But Eli carried a secret, one that no one else in the village knew." The disciples, captivated by the introduction, listened intently as Jesus' words painted a picture of Eli's life. Eli's heart was different from the hearts of other men. It was not made of flesh and blood like the hearts of the villagers. No, Eli's heart was made of pure crystal, clear, flawless, and beautiful. It shone with a light that was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, but Eli never let anyone see it. He believed that his crystal heart, while beautiful, was far too fragile to be exposed to the world. Jesus paused for a moment, allowing the image of Eli's crystal heart to settle in their minds. The disciples could almost imagine the radiant, delicate heart beating within Eli's chest, a treasure too precious to be shared. Eli feared that if anyone ever saw his heart, Jesus continued, they might touch it, and in touching it they might shatter it. So Eli built walls around his heart. He kept it hidden, protecting it from the harshness of the world. He believed that by guarding his heart, he could keep it safe from harm. The disciples exchanged glances. They understood Eli's fear all too well. How often had they themselves built walls around their hearts, afraid of letting others see their weaknesses, afraid of being hurt by those they loved. As the years went by, Jesus said, his voice growing softer, Eli's life became more and more isolated. Though he was kind to the people of his village, he never allowed anyone to get too close. He kept his distance, fearing that if they knew the truth about his heart, they would break it. Jesus' eyes swept across the faces of his disciples, who were now deeply absorbed in the story. He could see their internal struggle, their desire to love and be loved, and yet their fear of vulnerability. Eli's life of solitude continued for many years. Jesus went on. And though he had protected his heart from breaking, something else had happened. The light within his crystal heart, the beautiful light that once shone so brightly, began to fade. The heart, though unbroken, grew dim. It was no longer the radiant, shining heart it had once been. Without the warmth of love, without the touch of others, the heart had lost its luster. The disciples could feel the weight of Eli's loneliness. They imagined him walking through the village, seeing the joy in the lives of others, yet feeling an emptiness in his own heart. Though it was unbroken, Eli's heart was no longer alive. Then one day, Jesus continued, something happened that would change Eli's life forever. The disciples leaned in, sensing that the turning point in the story was near. A great storm swept through the village. It was a storm unlike any the people had ever seen. The winds howled, the rain poured down in torrents, and trees were uprooted by the force of the gale. The villagers scrambled to protect their homes, but the storm was relentless and many houses were damaged. In the chaos of the storm, a young child became trapped beneath the fallen branches of a tree. The child's cries for help were drowned out by the roar of the wind, but Eli heard them. Jesus paused again, his eyes reflecting the intensity of the moment. The disciples held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Eli ran into the storm, driven by a sense of compassion he had not felt in many years. He saw the child, struggling beneath the branches, and without thinking of the danger, he began to lift the heavy wood. The rain lashed against his skin, and the wind whipped through his hair, but Eli did not stop. He pushed aside the branches, freeing the child from the wreckage. The disciples were on edge, hanging on every word. They could see Eli battling against the storm, his heart pounding in his chest. But what they did not expect was what happened next. In the process of rescuing the child, Jesus said, his voice soft but firm, Eli's chest was struck by a sharp piece of debris. The walls he had built around his heart were shattered, and his crystal heart, so carefully protected for all those years, was now exposed. And in that moment Eli's worst fear came true. His heart, fragile as it was, cracked. The disciples gasped, their eyes wide with shock. They could feel Eli's devastation, the fear and pain of watching his heart, his most precious possession, break before his very eyes. But Jesus continued, his voice gentle, something unexpected happened. As Eli knelt in the rain, cradling his broken heart, he noticed something. The cracks in the crystal, the very thing he had feared for so long, were now allowing light to shine through. The light that had once been trapped inside, hidden away behind walls, was now pouring out through the cracks, illuminating the darkness around him. The disciples' expressions softened as they realized the beauty in what Jesus was saying. Eli's heart, though broken, was now shining more brightly than ever before. The villagers gathered around, Jesus said, and instead of seeing weakness in Eli's broken heart, they saw strength. They saw the beauty of a heart that had been opened, a heart that had been willing to be broken for the sake of love. Jesus paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The disciples sat in silence, their hearts stirred by the simple yet profound truth of Eli's story. And the child, Jesus continued, looked up at Eli with tears in his eyes and whispered, "Your heart saved me." And in that moment, Eli realized that his heart had never been truly alive when it was hidden. It was only in its openness and its willingness to be seen that it revealed its true beauty. As Jesus finished the story, the disciples remained quiet, each one reflecting on the lesson they had just heard. Some had tears in their eyes, others sat with their heads bowed, contemplating the deeper meaning behind Jesus' words. After a moment, Jesus spoke again, his voice full of tenderness. "My beloved friends," he said, "do you see now? Your heart, like Eli's, is not meant to be hidden away. It was made to shine, but it can only do so when you are willing to be open, to let others see the light within you. Vulnerability is not a weakness. It is the truest form of strength. Only when we allow others to see our cracks, our imperfections, can the light of God's love truly shine through us." The disciples looked at Jesus, their faces softened by the understanding that had dawned within them. They realized that Jesus was not just speaking of Eli, he was speaking of them, of every soul that had ever feared being vulnerable, of every heart that had built walls to protect itself from pain. Jesus smiled, his eyes filled with compassion. "Do not fear the breaking of your heart," he said. "For it is in the breaking that your heart becomes stronger, more radiant. It is through your openness, your willingness to be vulnerable, that you will discover the true power of love." The disciples nodded, their hearts lighter than they had been before. They understood now that love was not about keeping themselves safe, but about giving themselves fully, even when it meant risking pain. They realized that the cracks in their hearts were not something to be ashamed of, but something to embrace. It was through those cracks that the light of God's love would shine brightest. With a gentle smile, Jesus gave them his final words of wisdom. "Remember this," he said, "a heart that is never open can never truly love. Do not be afraid of the cracks, for they are the places where the light of God's love enters. Through those cracks, your heart will shine brighter than any crystal." As the disciples sat in the glow of the fading firelight, they felt a deep peace settle over them. The fears that had once gripped their hearts had loosened, and in their place was a new understanding, a new freedom. They realized that the greatest strength lay not in guarding their hearts, but in opening them even when it felt risky, even when it felt vulnerable. And as they sat beneath the stars, they knew that their hearts, though cracked and imperfect, were made to shine with the light of love. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.